When Melania Trump filed a lawsuit against Jasmine Crockett, no one expected the trial would spiral into a public reckoning until one witness revealed a truth that changed everything in under 10 seconds. The moment the headline broke, it felt like the ground beneath Washington shook. First Lady Melania Trump sues Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for defamation. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a real legal filing stamped at the top with Melania Trump's name. For many Americans, the question wasn't if this would spark a storm. It was how big the storm would get. Think about it. A First Lady, someone who had usually remained quiet in political brawls, decided to drag a rising Democratic star into court. That alone guaranteed cameras outside the courthouse, reporters swarming, and cable networks filling airtime with endless speculation. But what really made jaws drop was the idea of this case wasn't about policy or power struggles in Congress. It was about words. Words Jasmine Crockett had spoken sharp and direct that Melania's team claimed crossed the line into defamation. In today's world, where every sentence can be clipped, tweeted, replayed, and dissected, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The Dallas courthouse was where it all began. Early morning, the air sticky with Texas heat. Yet, that didn't stop the crowd. Protesters with homemade signs stood shoulder to shoulder with Trump supporters draped in flags. Reporters leaned over barricades, shouting questions at anyone in a suit who walked by. A local woman on the corner holding iced coffee whispered to a friend, "This feels bigger than a trial. It feels like history." Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Wooden benches filled with journalists, legal experts, and curious citizens who had squeezed in. At the front sat two women whose lives couldn't be more different. Melania, elegant and reserved, every movement measured. Crockett, fiery and unapologetic, with a gaze that dared anyone to silence her. "Mrs. Trump versus Representative Crockett," the clerk called out. The words rang through the room. In that moment, every eye turned forward. This wasn't just another lawsuit. It was a clash of legacies. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is. She isn't the type to tiptoe around controversy. A freshman congresswoman from Texas, she built her reputation on bold statements, grilling opponents, and speaking for communities often ignored in political halls. She doesn't whisper, she projects. That's part of why she gained attention so quickly and also why someone as insulated as Melania Trump would take the risk of facing her heat in court. But lawsuits are never simple. Melania's team insisted Crockett's remarks weren't just political banter. They claimed she suggested things about Melania's involvement in financial dealings. Suggestions damaging enough to trigger this legal showdown. To Melania's supporters, this was about protecting dignity and drawing a line. To Crockett's backers, it looked like an attempt to muzzle a voice that had rattled the White House. Cameras clicked furiously as the lawyers walked in. Reporters scribbled notes as fast as their hands could move. Every detail mattered. The color of Melania's dress, the expression on Crockett's face, even how each woman adjusted her posture. Because everyone knew this case was about more than the courtroom. It was about image, perception, and narrative. Crockett leaned toward her attorney and whispered something, earning a small nod in return. Melania didn't flinch. Her expression was unreadable, but she clutched her pen tightly against her folder. These two women weren't just separated by ideology. They were separated by approach. Melania, carefully curated, a portrait of silence turned to speech only when necessary. Crockett, loud and unafraid, her very presence a challenge to the structure of power. The first few minutes of that morning made one thing clear. No matter the outcome, this trial would not leave either woman untouched. Reputations would be tested. Secrets would be hinted at, and the whole nation would be watching, waiting for the spark that could ignite something larger. Outside, chants grew louder. Some shouted support for Melania, calling Crockett reckless. Others cheered for Jasmine, praising her courage to stand up even when the odds seemed stacked. Police lined the steps to keep tension from boiling over. But inside, in that wooden courtroom, where history had already started to write itself, the silence between arguments was louder than the shouting outside. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about truth versus perception, courage versus control, and the dangerous gamble of dragging words into a courtroom. But before the first argument was even made, people already wondered who would come out of this trial standing taller and who would leave with their legacy cracked beyond repair. If you're going to understand why this lawsuit exploded the way it did, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett really is. Not the headlines, not the talking points, but the story behind the firebrand voice that landed her in that courtroom across from Melania Trump. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise through the political ranks quietly. Before she ever stood in Congress, she built her name in Dallas courtrooms defending people who didn't have the money or connections to protect themselves. She was the attorney who would take late-night calls from a worried mother whose son was arrested or a father who feared losing his job over a misunderstanding. People in those neighborhoods didn't just know Jasmine as a lawyer. They knew her as someone who cared enough to fight. Jasmine never walked away from a hard case, recalled Andre Phillips, a local activist who had worked with her years earlier. She wasn't scared of judges, prosecutors, or anybody else. She believed in looking people in the eye and telling the truth, even if it wasn't pretty. That blunt honesty, sharp enough to sting, fearless enough to ruffle feathers, was what carried her from local politics all the way to Washington. She didn't polish her words for comfort. She sharpened them for impact. And it worked. When Jasmine won her congressional seat, critics thought she'd eventually mellow out, learn to play the game like so many others do once they land in D.C. But she didn't. If anything, her voice only grew louder on committee floors, in press interviews, across social media. Crockett became known for clapping back when someone tried to cut her off or minimize her point. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had told her, "We don't have a voice up there." That defiance of political etiquette made her a target. Lobbyists didn't like her. Career politicians rolled their eyes when she walked in. Conservative media painted her as reckless, while progressives saw her as a breath of fresh air. And through it all, Jasmine seemed unfazed. So when she made comments that touched on Melania Trump's role during certain Trump-era dealings, nobody was surprised by the boldness of her words, but people were surprised by the response. Instead of ignoring her, brushing it off as political theater, Melania took action. As one reporter asked on a morning talk show, "Why Jasmine? Out of all the critics the Trump family has faced, why single out this Congresswoman?" That question lingered because Jasmine wasn't the most famous name in Congress, nor the most powerful. She didn't chair a committee. She wasn't running for president. Yet, somehow, she had struck a nerve deep enough that the First Lady of the United States decided to take her to court. Part of it was Crockett's fearlessness. She wasn't someone you could intimidate into silence. Threats of lawsuits didn't push her off balance. If anything, they fueled her. And that was dangerous for someone like Melania, who had built her public image on control, elegance, and careful distance from controversy. Jasmine was her opposite. Raw, blunt, and unwilling to apologize. And then there was the symbolism. For millions of people watching, this wasn't just a legal battle between two women. It was a collision of two very different Americas. On one side, a congresswoman who came from modest beginnings, fought her way through law school and built her platform on being unfiltered. On the other, a first lady with global recognition, a name associated with wealth, power, and a carefully cultivated image. When the lawsuit was filed, Jasmine didn't back down. In fact, she leaned in harder. Standing outside her district office in Dallas, she told reporters, "If speaking the truth about power lands me in court, then that's exactly where I'm supposed to be. I don't run. I don't hide." Those words played on loop across networks. Supporters cheered her bravery. Critics called it arrogance. But everyone agreed on one thing. Jasmine Crockett wasn't scared. That was the key. Fearlessness. It's what made her dangerous in politics. What made her compelling to her supporters and what made this lawsuit more than just legal paperwork. It became a test of whether someone who had always spoken truth to power could survive a direct strike from one of the most powerful figures in the country. Her staff, though, saw the strain behind the bold words. Late nights in her office, stacks of legal files on her desk, Jasmine sometimes rubbed her temples, knowing what was at stake. They want to break me, she admitted to one aide. But if I bend now, I'll never be able to stand up again. The lawsuit wasn't just about clearing her name for Jasmine. It was about survival. Not just politically, but personally. If she lost, she risked being branded reckless forever. If she won, she'd prove that even the highest office in the land couldn't silence her. But while Jasmine's defiance made headlines, the bigger question remained: what drove Melania to risk everything by taking her to court in the first place? For years, Melania Trump built a reputation on silence. While her husband commanded headlines and courted controversy, she stayed mostly in the background. Her words were rare, her appearances calculated, her image carefully controlled. That's why when news broke that she had decided to sue Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, people were stunned. It wasn't just unusual, it was historic. No First Lady in modern times had ever dragged a sitting Congresswoman into a courtroom over defamation. So the obvious question was, why now? Why Crockett? Behind the polished surface, Melania's world had always been more fragile than it looked. Being First Lady wasn't just about fashion and galas. It meant being scrutinized at every turn. Her motives questioned, her private life dissected. While she managed to maintain a certain mystique, Crockett's comments had pierced the carefully constructed armor. According to Melania's legal team, the Congresswoman's remarks went beyond political criticism. They claimed Crockett had implied involvement in behind-the-scenes dealings that could tarnish Melania's reputation permanently. For a woman who had spent years crafting an image of elegance and distance from Washington's chaos, those words weren't just insulting, they were dangerous. "She's not protecting her husband here," said one legal analyst on CBS. "She's protecting herself. This case is about her own identity, her own dignity." Inside the East Wing, advisors debated for weeks before the lawsuit was filed. Some argued it would only give Crockett more attention, painting her as a fighter against power. Others insisted silence would be seen as weakness. In the end, Melania made the call herself. "I will not let lies stand," she reportedly told one aide, her voice sharp, uncharacteristically firm. Her choice carried enormous risk. By filing, she opened herself up to scrutiny, depositions, cross-examinations, the press digging into her history, things she had long tried to avoid. But Melania wasn't acting out of impulse. She believed this case could be her moment to show strength on her own terms. Supporters rallied to her side. At rallies in Texas and Florida, women waved signs reading, "Protect Melania's dignity." Conservative commentators praised her for finally fighting back. Even some critics admitted it was bold. But boldness cuts both ways. For Jasmine Crockett, the lawsuit was a gift. "You've just handed her a microphone," said political strategist Karen Verrill on MSNBC. "Now Crockett doesn't have to fight to be heard. This case guarantees her airtime every day." Still, Melania was no stranger to risk. She had navigated scandals before, kept her composure when others would have crumbled. She believed her team could handle Crockett. But the thing about lawsuits is that once they're in motion, control slips away. Judges make decisions. Witnesses reveal secrets. Journalists dig where you least expect. And that was the danger. By taking Crockett to court, Melania wasn't just defending her image. She was gambling with it. Inside the courthouse, her attorney spoke in measured tones, framing Crockett's remarks as reckless slander that blurred the line between truth and fiction. They pointed to Crockett's fiery style, her reputation for throwing sharp words that cut deep. "This is not about politics," Melania's lead lawyer declared. "It is about accountability. It is about protecting the integrity of the First Lady of the United States." Melania herself remained quiet through most of it, her face unreadable, but every so often she scribbled notes and slid them to her attorney. Observers described her demeanor as icy calm, a contrast to the buzzing energy surrounding her. For a moment, it looked like the lawsuit might work. The arguments were clean, the legal foundation solid. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Because every defamation case has a burden, proof. And proof requires evidence, testimony, context. Crockett's lawyers knew that. They didn't just prepare a defense, they prepared an offense. Meanwhile, commentators outside the courtroom debated Melania's motives endlessly. Some framed it as personal pride. Others suggested it was a calculated distraction from other controversies swirling around Washington. A late-night host even joked, "When you're the First Lady suing a Congresswoman, that's not called defamation. It's called ratings." Still, for all the cynicism, there was a deeper layer here. Melania had always been a symbol of elegance, of silence, of control. By filing this lawsuit, she tried to redefine herself as someone who wouldn't be pushed around. But symbols are fragile, and when they crack they shatter quickly. Reporters camped outside the Dallas courthouse knew they were watching history. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a collision of personalities, reputations, and the very idea of who gets to define truth in America. For Melania, the risk was enormous. But for Jasmine Crockett, the opportunity was priceless. If Melania believed she had the stronger case, she was about to learn that courtroom battles aren't just won with lawyers, they're won with moments. And one moment in particular would soon turn the trial on its head. Dallas's old Cabell Federal Building had seen high-profile trials before, but nothing quite like this. From the moment the sun came up, the courthouse looked less like a place of justice and more like the epicenter of a national spectacle. Satellite trucks lined the street. Reporters from as far away as Los Angeles and Miami elbowed for camera space. A group of college students from nearby Southern Methodist University camped out overnight just to say they were there. Inside, the air conditioning hummed against the Texas heat, but the tension in the packed courtroom made the space feel thick, almost suffocating. The smell of coffee drifted from paper cups clutched by tired journalists who hadn't slept properly in days. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the gavel to drop. On the front bench, Melania Trump sat with immaculate posture, her beige suit sharp, her hair pinned in its usual polished wave. Every movement, adjusting her pen, lifting a glass of water, seemed deliberate, practiced. A few feet away, Jasmine Crockett radiated a different kind of energy. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, flipping through notes, occasionally whispering to her attorney. Unlike Melania, whose face revealed nothing, Crockett's expressions flickered. Irritation when a camera clicked too loudly. Amusement when her aide passed her a sly comment. Steel whenever her eyes drifted to Melania's table. Reporters whispered to each other. They don't even look at one another. The judge, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, entered briskly and took his seat. "Court is now in session," he declared. His voice carried the weight of routine, but even he seemed aware this was no ordinary case. As proceedings began, Melania's lead attorney, Philip Ransom, rose to speak. His tone was smooth, almost theatrical, crafted for both the jury and the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." Representative Crockett went beyond the boundaries of free speech. She didn't criticize policy. She didn't question political strategy. She accused the First Lady of the United States of impropriety in matters she had no evidence for. These statements were broadcast, repeated, and believed by millions. That is not politics. That is defamation. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Crockett scribbled a note and slid it to her attorney, Linda Garvey, who smirked briefly before tucking it into her folder. When Ransom sat down, Garvey rose. Her stride was purposeful. Her voice cutting. "This trial isn't about protecting dignity. It's about silencing dissent. My client spoke about influence, transparency, and accountability, the very things we expect of our leaders. Mrs. Trump may not like what was said, but dislike is not the same as defamation. Truth is not defamation, and attempting to muzzle a sitting member of Congress for doing her job is a dangerous precedent." Crockett glanced at the jury as Garvey spoke, making eye contact with a middle-aged woman in the front row, who scribbled furiously in her notebook. The atmosphere thickened as both sides laid out opening arguments. Each sentence seemed designed not just for the 12 jurors, but for the millions following on television and online. A reporter from the Dallas Morning News tapped rapidly at her laptop, muttering, "This is going to be the trial of the decade." On the benches behind, spectators whispered back and forth. A man in a worn baseball cap leaned toward his wife. "I don't care what you think about politics," he said softly. Seeing the First Lady sue a Congresswoman, that's wild. At one point during a recess, Crockett stood near the defense table sipping water. A reporter called out from the gallery, "Congresswoman, do you regret your comments?" She didn't hesitate. "Regret," she replied, her voice carrying across the room. "The only thing I regret is how fragile the truth seems to be for some people." The remark drew chuckles from her supporters and sharp looks from Melania's team. Back in session, tension mounted as witnesses were called to testify about the impact of Crockett's comments. A political consultant described how her remarks had been replayed across networks, sparking headlines. Melania's attorneys emphasized the harm done to her reputation, but Crockett's team countered, public figures live in the spotlight. Criticism comes with the role. By the afternoon, even the judge seemed aware this case was no longer confined to defamation statutes. It was becoming a battle over free speech itself. His gavel knocked against the bench after a heated exchange between the attorneys. "Control yourselves," he warned, though his stern voice did little to settle the charged energy. Cameras weren't allowed inside the courtroom, but that didn't stop sketch artists from furiously capturing every glance, every raised eyebrow, every flicker of emotion between the two women. One sketch showed Crockett leaning forward, her finger pointed sharply across the table, while Melania stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. As the day wound down, the air inside the courtroom felt even heavier than when it began. Both sides had drawn their battle lines. Neither woman had flinched. And though only the first stones had been thrown, it was clear to everyone present this was going to be a fight unlike anything the country had ever seen. But the real turning point wasn't in the opening arguments. It was waiting just ahead in the details of Melania's case, and the defense Crockett's team was prepared to unleash. By the second morning of the trial, the rhythm of the courtroom was already established. Reporters sprinted up the courthouse steps before sunrise, clutching phones and laptops. Security lines stretched around the block. Inside, the benches filled fast. A mix of political aides, curious law students, and everyday Texans who had never before seen a First Lady up close. When the judge gave a nod, Philip Ransom, Melania Trump's lead attorney, rose with deliberate confidence. He wore a navy suit that looked freshly pressed, even in the humid Dallas air, and his voice filled the room with a clarity honed by decades of courtroom experience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began. "Words have consequences. This case is not about politics. It is about reputation. It is about the truth." Representative Crockett crossed the line when she accused the First Lady of involvement in matters that had no basis in fact. These weren't offhand remarks. These were accusations broadcast and amplified to millions of Americans. And those words caused real damage. He paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. Then he continued, "The First Lady is not here as a politician. She is here as a woman, as a wife, as a mother whose name has been smeared. We are asking you to hold Representative Crockett accountable." The jurors sat stone-faced. Pens scratched across notebooks. Behind them, journalists typed furiously. Melania kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face expressionless, though now and then she leaned toward Ransom, whispering something too quiet to catch. Ransom called the first witness, a media analyst from Arizona named Simon Larry. Larry specialized in tracking how stories spread across television and social media. He pulled up graphs and charts showing how Crockett's remarks had been clipped, shared, and replayed thousands of times in the weeks after she made them. These comments didn't just stay in Washington, Larry explained. They spread nationally. They became part of the news cycle, and each repetition magnified the damage to the First Lady's image. Ransom nodded. "In your professional opinion, did Representative Crockett's statements impact the way Americans perceive the First Lady?" "Yes," Larry replied firmly. "They painted her in a light that was damaging and misleading." The jury scribbled notes. Crockett sat back, her pen tapping against the table, her eyes locked on the witness with a look that could slice steel. Next, Ransom brought in a public relations consultant, Dana Mercer from Phoenix, who testified about the toll reputational damage can take. She spoke about lost opportunities, strained relationships with organizations, and the long shadow cast by public scandal. If people believe a false story, even once it's corrected, the damage lingers, Mercer said. That's the nature of perception. Ransom turned toward the jury. This is not about criticism of policy. This is about reckless words aimed at a person, and that person is sitting right here. He gestured toward Melania. For the first time since the trial began, Melania's eyes lifted toward the jury. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at them, a steady gaze that suggested both resolve and fragility. But if Melania's case was strong on optics, cracks began to show under questioning. When Crockett's attorney, Linda Garvey, rose for cross-examination, the tone shifted. Mr. Larry Garvey began smoothly. You've testified that Representative Crockett's words spread quickly across the country. That's correct. Yes. Yes. Would you agree that the First Lady is already one of the most scrutinized women in the world? Larry hesitated. Yes. And would you also agree that public figures are subject to criticism, sometimes harsh criticism, as part of their roles? Yes. So, in fact, what you're saying is not that Representative Crockett created scrutiny, but that she contributed to a cycle of criticism that already existed. Ransom objected, but the judge allowed the question. Larry shifted uncomfortably. That's one way of looking at it. Yes. The jurors glanced at each other. Reporters typed faster. Garvey pressed further with Mercer, the PR consultant. You spoke about reputational damage, but tell me, if a statement is true, is it still defamation? No, Mercer admitted. And who decides if it's true or false? That would be for the court to determine. Exactly. The answer Garvey wanted. She smiled slightly, then returned to her seat. The momentum seemed to waver. Melania's case had started strong, but Crockett's team had already begun poking holes in the foundation. During the lunch recess, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones shoved in every direction. A journalist from the Texas Tribune asked bluntly, if Melania wins, does that mean every member of Congress has to watch their words, or does it mean she's protecting herself from lies? Where's the line? Inside, Melania sat quietly at the plaintiff's table. Her attorneys huddled around her. Crockett, meanwhile, laughed with her team, the sound carrying across the room. To outsiders, it looked like two different worlds. One steeped in controlled silence, the other alive with defiant energy. By the end of the day, jurors had heard the heart of Melania's case. Words matter, reputations matter, and Crockett's comments had consequences. But what no one could predict was how dramatically the balance of power would shift once Crockett's side took its turn. When it came time for Jasmine Crockett's defense, her lawyers weren't just ready to respond. They were prepared to flip the narrative on its head. By the time the defense took the floor, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. Reporters had already begun framing the trial as a test of free speech versus reputation. Crockett sat at her table, arms folded, her face calm, but her energy unmistakable, like a boxer waiting for the bell. Her attorney, Linda Garvey, rose with a thick binder in hand, but her opening line came without notes. Ladies and gentlemen, Garvey said, her voice sharp but steady. This case is not about protecting dignity. It's about silencing a voice. A voice that has asked tough questions. A voice that has spoken truth about influence and power. Representative Crockett did not invent anything. She said what millions of Americans were already asking. And now the First Lady wants to punish her for saying it out loud. A ripple ran through the gallery. Crockett glanced at the jury, locking eyes with a man in the back row who leaned forward in his chair. She didn't smile, but her gaze carried a message. I'm not afraid to stand here. Garvey called her first witness, a political historian named Dr. Anthony Ward from the University of Texas at Austin. Ward explained the tradition of elected officials questioning the behavior of public figures. Democracy depends on scrutiny, he testified. Public criticism is not only allowed, it is expected. If we punish representatives for speaking about those in power, we weaken the entire system. Ransom rose quickly for cross-examination. Dr. Ward, are you suggesting that any public official can say whatever they want, no matter how damaging, without accountability? Ward didn't blink. I'm saying criticism of public figures is a cornerstone of democracy. If accountability comes at the cost of silencing dissent, we risk losing something far greater than reputation. Crockett leaned toward Garvey and whispered, "That's the line right there." Garvey nodded. The next witness brought even more fire. A community organizer from Fort Worth, Angela Moreno, testified about Crockett's history of advocacy. "She's always been our voice. She says the things we're too afraid to say. If she gets sued for that, what chance do the rest of us have?" Ransom objected, calling it irrelevant, but the judge allowed the statement to stand. Finally, it was time for Crockett herself to take the stand. The courtroom hushed as she rose, walked to the witness chair, and placed her hand on the Bible. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. "Congresswoman Crockett," Garvey began. "Why did you make the comment that led to this lawsuit?" Crockett's voice was even, but every word carried weight. "Because I believe the American people deserve transparency. Because when you see patterns of influence, you don't stay quiet. And because being in Congress isn't about protecting the powerful, it's about protecting the people who sent me here." Garvey let the silence stretch. Then asked, "Did you intend to harm the First Lady personally?" "No," Crockett answered firmly. "I intended to shine light where too many people prefer darkness. If that's considered harm, then we need to question what we're protecting in this country." Ransom rose for cross-examination, adjusting his tie before stepping forward. "Congresswoman, you understand the weight of your words, don't you?" "I do." "And you admit that your comments suggested Mrs. Trump was involved in questionable dealings?" "I admit I raised questions." Crockett shot back. "Questions based on patterns we all witnessed. So you had no direct evidence?" Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Evidence doesn't appear out of thin air, Mr. Ransom. Sometimes it takes someone asking the uncomfortable question to bring it into the light." The jury's eyes flickered between the two. Ransom pressed again. "So you're saying you made damaging statements without proof?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "I'm saying I did my job, and if doing my job means upsetting powerful people, so be it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order." Crockett sat back in her chair, unbothered, her chin lifted slightly. She wasn't just defending herself. She was making a broader point.